first lesson today is from Proverbs chapter 3, beginning at the 5th verse. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not rely on your own insight. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord, and turn away from evil. It will be a healing for your flesh, and a refreshment for your body. Here ends the lesson.
I invite you to please stand for the reading of our gospel. You have a few verses from this gospel written inside your worship folder, but I'm going to expand it. I want to read you a little of what was going on before and what was going on after. In the light of things that have gone on in our world this week, I thought it was important to introduce some of the folks who were also taking part in this story of when Jesus healed the little girl. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat on the way to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue, named Jairus, came, and when he saw him, he fell at his feet. And he begged Jesus repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she might be made well and live." So Jesus went with him, and a large crowd followed him, and it pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians, and she'd spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather she had grown worse. She'd heard about Jesus, and she came up behind him in the crowd, and she touched his cloak, for she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately, her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd, and he said, "Hey, who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?' Like, really, who would know?" He looked all around to see who had done it, but the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and in trembling. And she fell down before Jesus, and she told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Don't trouble the teacher any longer." But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, Don't fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him now except for Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader in the synagogue, he saw a commotion. There were people weeping, and they were wailing loudly. When he entered, he said to them, "Why do you all make a commotion and weep? The child isn't dead. She's sleeping." And they laughed at him. They laughed at him. And then Jesus put them all outside, and he took the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and he went in where the child was. He took her by the hand, and he said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up, and she began to walk about. She was maybe 12 years old. At this, they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this, and he told them to give her something to eat. This is the gospel of our Lord. Please be seated. What's your name?
patch. I have a cold. I have a cold. It's almost red. Oh, my hands. It's red. I believe it. Next day. Yeah. It's looking good. Find a place for that.
What is going on here?
Maybe you remember the movie, Patch Adams. It was my favorite of Robin Williams' many movies. Came out in 1998. And it was based on the real story of a place in West Virginia called the Gesundheit Institute, where a particular doctor who went by Patch Adams, where he really believed that people needed to be treated not as illnesses, but as people. Patients weren't illnesses, and illnesses weren't patients. This little place in Hillsborough, West Virginia, began 40 years ago. And since then, the Gesundheit Institute has offered care to tens of thousands of people. It's given workshops and lectures in over 65 countries. It's built and supported clinics, schools, and orphanages from El Salvador to Cambodia. And it's brought the joy of clowning to parts of the world that have been damaged by violence and injustice in just 40 years. The first I learned of it, the Gesundheit Institute, was when Robin Williams put on that red rubber nose and had a ward filled with children who were struggling with cancer in stitches. Not in sutures, but in stitches. There's been a lot of talk and a lot of mourning about Robin Williams this week. A lot of remembering his roles, things those characters once said. Maybe you met Robin Williams as the fun-loving alien named Mork, or as a dad who dressed as a nanny so that he could spend more time with his kids, the old Mrs. Doubtfire, maybe he was the therapist in Good Will Hunting to you, the poetry teacher in Dead Poet Society, or the DJ in Good Morning Vietnam. His roles ran the gamut again, from a homeless man in The Fisher King to the genie who lived in a bottle for 10,000 years in Aladdin. And my goodness, living in a bottle for 10,000 years could really cause a prick in your neck. But whichever role may strike us the most, one thing that has held my attention this week is that no matter how many faces the world may know us by, we aren't to be made known to the world simply by the roles that we play, or our status in the community, or our accomplishments, or the lack of them. I expanded our gospel reading for today because I wanted us to meet a few folks who were around Jesus in this enormous crowd that flocked to him that day of that healing. First, there was Jairus, leader of the synagogue, a big deal of a guy, really. People came to him for help, for guidance, for direction. And remember, Jewish men in Jesus' day and age, even if they weren't leaders of the synagogue, didn't run. They didn't bow down and stoop and fall at the needs of people. They had a certain amount of decorum that they needed to display. But Jairus' little girl was sick. To heck with decorum, right? If you've ever had a sick kid, you know that the last thing you care about is decorum. So he throws himself at Jesus' feet and he begs him to come to his home and to do this healing work that Jesus is just starting to be known for. Well, they're on their way, more people gather, and there's a woman. She's the opposite of Jairus, really. She's not a leader. She's not a man. She's probably not even part of a synagogue, because, see, women just didn't have standing in that day. And a bleeding woman, a hemorrhaging woman, was said to be ritually unclean, so she wouldn't be allowed anywhere near that synagogue. She hadn't been part of a religious gathering for a dozen years or more. And who knows if she would have been part of that synagogue before the bleeding began. But she too pressed upon Jesus in that crowd. She threw herself at the other side of his feet, behind him. She just wanted to touch his clothes, just get a glimpse, just a little bit. That was all she needed to be made well. She knew it in her heart. And sure enough, it happened. She felt it. Jesus felt it. And rather than accuse her of breaking all of the rules, Jesus told her that her faith made her well, that she'd been healed. Now she could be at peace. And no sooner did Jesus and Jairus get on the road from there than the people who had been watching over the leader's sick daughter came out to meet them on the road. "Save Jesus time, Jairus, your daughter is dead." Now that's an interesting greeting, right? I'd like to think somebody might take Jairus aside. "Hey, can we talk for a minute? Here's a cup of coffee." Sometimes things don't go the way we think that they're gonna, but hey, leave Jesus alone because your daughter kicked it. You know, that's just not really what you think they might say on the road. But Jesus speaks to Jairus, and he tells him those words that we've heard now for 3 weeks in a row. We're just following through the Gospel of Mark consecutively. When the disciples were worried they wouldn't have enough food to feed the 5,000 men and the women and the children, Jesus says, "Don't worry. Don't be afraid. It's going to be okay. There's always more than you think there is. Just bring me the food and there will be enough. There will be enough. Quit worrying." Last week, the disciples are in a boat on a stormy sea. Everything's rocking. They're not sure of anything anymore. And Jesus walks across the water to them and he says, "Don't be afraid." Peter starts to walk. He sinks. Jesus says, "Why are you afraid?" And so now Jesus leans into Jairus and he says, "Don't be afraid. It's okay. your daughter's okay. And who knows what Jairus might have thought right in those moments. But Jesus gathers up a few folks, Peter and James and John. He asks the people inside why they're crying, and they look at him like he was a damn fool. And they laughed right in his face. They laughed right at him. And he just gets the little girls, mommy and daddy, and his followers, and he says, come on back. And they go back to his room, and he puts his hands on her, and he says, little girl, get home. And she does. And they can hardly believe their eyes. They can hardly believe their eyes. I've wondered this week what Robin Williams might have said to Jesus. Had he been in that crowd all gathering around this new religious leader? Would he have done some impersonations? You know, he was really good at those. Would he have played a role in hopes of making the other people around feel better? Or would he have shared that deep part within himself that we know now was there? Help me, Jesus. Help me. I'm hurting. And that's the problem with both mental illness. We tend to keep it hidden away. Heck, we don't even want people to know if we're sad or afraid or feeling alone, much less if we're clinically depressed or having suicidal thoughts. And it's the problem with all the seeming masks that we seem to wear in this life. So the story in the Gospel of Mark here today is a really beautiful story. It gives us a cross-section of people. There's Jairus, a leader, a hotshot, a big deal. There's a woman who's been bleeding for 12 years, and we aren't even told her name. You know why not? Probably because nobody there bothered to know it. Nobody bothered to lean in and say, hey, what's your name? Like I asked the kids in the children's sermon today to try to find out on those days of school. Look for the kids who nobody knows their name and ask them what their name is. And then there's this little girl. She's 12. And what we learn along the way is that each one of them experiences healing in some sort or another. Now, they aren't going to live forever. None of them. And I don't think that's what this story is ultimately about. And actually, that's the thing that I find it hard to reconcile in all these healing stories in Scripture. Because for every story of a healing or a miracle, there's the person who doesn't live, or the baby that dies, or the accident that happens, or the suicide attempt that's successful. Does that mean God doesn't love those people? No, that is not what that means. It just means, I think, that each and every one of us is vulnerable. And each and every one of us is invited to be part of the journey, the real journey behind the mask of what matters and what it means to be human, to be real. To recognize who we are in our heart of hearts is ultimately what matters in this walk of faith. Someone told me last week, I'm going to be in church on Sunday, but I'm just warning you now, it's been kind of one of those weeks for me and I might cry. And I said, if you can't cry here, there's no place you can't cry. Because this is a safe place. And I want you to have lots of safe places. The story that we hear in the gospel about Jairus and the woman and the daughter, each one were vulnerable. And if you go back with me to that little clip from Patch Adams, there was a lot of vulnerability going on there too. But we'd all agree now that people aren't illnesses. and illnesses aren't people. Jesus didn't see Jairus and say, "Ah, sick kid." He looked at him with compassion. He saw a man whose heart was crumbling. He didn't look at the woman and say, "Ah, a society throwaway, unclean." He saw faith in her. And he didn't look at the daughter and say, "Gone." He took her hand and he asked her to arise. And so while I'm remarkably taken by Jesus' power to touch and change lives in these stories, I'm also deeply moved at what it means for God's people to be vulnerable and real with one another. See, that's where healing begins. That's where hearts take hold, and that's where new beginnings flourish. Patch Adams didn't look at those kids in the hospital ward and say, "Cancer, diagnosis," or even, "Don't get too close." He looked at them and he said, "Be real, be human, be love, be love." Not so different, really, than what Jesus said to the folks who thronged around him. Not so different from what he says to us. Be real, be human, be love. Not so different from what we're called to do, to be, and how we get to live. To be real with one another. To allow others the space to be real. And to be loved too.